Hello, my name is Dr. Elyse Zavar, and I'm from the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science in the College of Health and Public Services. I research how communities recover from disasters and mitigate or lessen their future exposure to hazards like floods, hurricanes, and chemical spills. My training and background is in hazard geography, so I often consider how the physical layout of our cities and towns contribute to the recovery and ultimately community resilience. And since I'm a geographer, I'm going to start with a map. So for me, maps help ask research questions as well as help me gain new insights so communities can reduce their losses from a disaster. So we're looking at a Google Earth satellite image of the Wheatley Heights neighborhood in Southeast San Antonio. Google Earth offers a really cool time hop feature, this button here, where you can move from present day aerial images, or the most recent, which is usually 2019, tends to be about a year lag, to older ones. So this one goes back to 1995. Some areas can go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but often coverage only extends to the early 1990s. These older images are often in black and white, and they're going to be more grainy than what you would see on the new satellite images today. Because it's a really good appreciation for how the science around satellite imagery has improved and how we have so much more detail in the newer images. But for our purposes, the images back to the 1990s work fine, and I'll explain a little bit more why in a minute. What you're seeing here is the Wheatley Heights neighborhood in 1995. So we have homes, all these little squares, trees, here's a school, here's the streets, there's a park area up here, and this dark area that's kind of snaking back and forth is a river. Specifically, it's Salado Creek. And I'm going to toggle from 1995 forward to 2012. And what I'd like you to do is try and keep your eye particularly on this section of the neighborhood. So here we go to 2012. We'll go back again and forward one more time. You'll notice that there are homes that were along these streets are gone. Now, we tend to be used to open fields being developed into new homes and businesses, but it's less common to see blocks of a neighborhood become open fields. These are what we call property buyouts, and it's a form of hazard mitigation. Basically, communities have decided that development occurred in places that are just too high risk, and so people need to be moved out of these high risk locations. And so local governments, funded in part by grants from the federal government, buy properties from willing homeowners. That's important. These are voluntary programs. These are the homes that have experienced often repetitive hazards, things like flooding multiple times. And that's what's happened here in Wheatley Heights. So remember how I said that the early 1990s satellite images would work fine for us? That's because this part of San Antonio experienced catastrophic flooding in both 1998 and 2002. And although there are some earlier examples, buyouts in the US ramped up after the 1993 Midwestern floods. And they have increased in popularity, particularly in the last decade, as communities face challenges like sea level rise, more intense hurricanes that produce more precipitation, like we saw from Harvey, Maria, and Michael, all things due to climate change. And so over 10 years ago, maps like this, seeing this transition from development to open space, really grabbed my attention. And I started asking research questions about these programs. Looking at these maps, you probably have questions that come to mind too. Like, where did the people relocate to? What is their life like in their new communities? And what do local communities do with the land after the houses have been removed? I get to work through these questions with colleagues and students, including undergraduates. One undergraduate asked the question, Are there any similar characteristics amongst the residents who decide to participate in the buyout versus those who don't? So now he's working through property records to identify if people who own their homes longer are more or less likely to participate in a buyout than those who've been in their homes a shorter amount of time. In my own work, I spend a lot of time working through questions about how communities manage the buyout land after the homes are removed. First, I start with the policies that govern these mitigation activities. So buyout land has to be converted to open space, meaning there will never be any buildings on it in the future. This is a federal mandate in order to get the grant money to pay for these buyout programs. And there's deed restrictions placed on these properties in perpetuity, meaning for all the future. Things like parks, playgrounds, walking trails, gardens, soccer fields, all these things are permitted and actually encouraged. You just can't have any structures with 4 walls. There are some exceptions around public restrooms and parks, depending on the building specifics. But all of these are set by the federal government, specifically governed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So after reading these policies, I wondered, which of these land uses actually occur? Which of these land uses do residents actually want in their neighborhoods? Do residents use them? Do residents think these land uses impact their property values? Which of these land uses do municipal governments put into place or want in their communities? So to address questions like this, I conduct interviews, surveys, and fieldwork where I visit buyout sites. There's approximately 40,000 buyout properties completed in the United States. I visited nearly 15,000 to conduct fieldwork. I've examined what communities do with the land after a buyout. Turns out most are mowed vacant lots, sort of like what you were seeing in those 2012 images in Wheatley Heights. Turns out that costs communities a lot of money to mow them. Cities like Austin and Houston here in Texas spend millions each year to mow vacant buyout lots. Houston happens to have one of the largest buyout programs in the country and oldest. So in my research, I'm trying to help communities identify land uses that are both high utility for residents, like a park or a playground or a walking trail, that offer a lot of mitigation value and are cost effective. So things like wetlands or areas that have walking trails around wetlands can both be high utility for residents, have a lot of mitigation benefit because wetlands can hold water, and are really cost effective because wetlands are far less maintenance than mowed open grass. So in the instance of Wheatley Heights, let's turn back to our map and see what the land looks like today. So I'm going to fast forward here to 2019, and it doesn't look like much has changed, right? But I want to zoom in because I've spent some time here, and you can start to see this is a soccer field. Here's the goals. Here's pavement for some parking. These are actually practice fields. They just don't have lines drawn on them in these maps. You've got some athletic equipment here as well. And you have this walking trail that's actually used as a cross-country track for meets. And if we go all the way to the north, we can see that this space has been connected to a park in the north. And so while they can't build a football stadium on the buyout land, this wasn't buyout land. It was a pre-existing park. And so they were able to connect and expand the services available for the residents. Specifically, a group of former neighbors worked together with local municipal leaders to create this athletic complex. So visiting this site now, after it had developed different land uses, raised other questions for me. Like when people visit the athletic complex, do they know the history of the land? And is it important that we are commemorating that history, to know that hazard history and what used to be here? So during my site visits, I've been to this location multiple times as it transitioned from mowed vacant lot to this athletic complex. And I found a plaque. This plaque is a form of commemoration. It honors the former residents who used to live in Wheatley Heights. It has an explanation of the flood history of the area. And as scholars who study disaster commemoration have pointed out, commemoration is really important for many reasons. For instance, commemoration from a disaster can help survivors process and heal. This is part of the mental and emotional recovery. Commemoration also educates and informs people who live outside and never experienced that disaster what can happen. And so it can be a form of risk reduction, meaning others can learn from that, think about similar risks in their own communities, take lessons that were effective and put them into place and mitigate risks that they face where they live. Now, there are still many questions out there related to buyouts and disaster recovery in general. I often hear from undergraduates just starting out in the research, but how do I come up with a question? Where do I start? And it can seem really daunting from the beginning. In research methods, we often rely on observations to advance our understanding, create new knowledge, and solve problems. But observations also help us ask questions. For me, looking at maps, visiting places, talking to people, even reading the news, help me formulate research questions. I encourage you to look around you. Keep your eyes open, ask questions. The research will find you, and your faculty here at UNT will help you work through those questions. Thanks for listening. I wish you all the best in your future pursuits.